I have scoured the bookish section of YouTube for book recommendations from other creators. I've read those books and now I'm going to review them. But while I'm reviewing them, I'm going to tell you about 8 wonderful content creators so that you can expand your book viewing pleasure. Is it just me, or is there something really ironic, the fact that we all watch TV to get book recommendations? So in today's video we have 8 books, as recommended by Jess at Stalking Kafka. We have Housekeeping by Marilyn Robinson. As recommended by Dee Dee at Brown Girl Reading, we have The Known World by Edward P. Jones. As recommended by Eric Carl Anderson, we have Bad Habits by Alana S. Portero. Translated from Spanish by Maria Fay Lethem. As recommended by Kieran at Kieran Reader, we have Brat by Gabrielle Smith. As recommended by Anna Marie at Actual Spinster, we have Little Fish by Casey Plett. As recommended by Shelley Swearingen, we have The Dutch House by Anne Patchett. As recommended by Gemma at Gem of Books, we have Things I Have Withheld by Kai Miller. And as recommended by Jack Edwards, we have Evenings and Weekends by Ocean McKenna. I'm going to review these books from worst to best, which is pretty standard for this channel now. And I'm going to talk about the content creator when I mentioned their book. And just because a creator comes in early on this list doesn't mean that they have terrible taste in literature, unless your name's Shelley. Shelley, my personal booktube nemesis, my booktube frenemy, who recommends The Dutch House by Anne Patchett. Shelley and I are opposites. We don't agree on much. So you might wonder, why, when there are literally thousands of creators out there, did you pick a creator with pretty questionable bookish taste? And that's because Shelley and I do actually agree on a few things, like reading and creating videos about books, or Middlemarch, which is one of 2 books I will claim as my favourite ever read. One of 2 books because I'm greedy. So you see, when we agree on books, it's correct. It's more correct than correct. It's an amazing, life-changing book. Unfortunately, The Dutch House wasn't one of those books. And look, if you're looking for a passionate, upbeat content creator who is just a big, joyful book geek, you should subscribe to Shelley's channel. You can really tell that creating bookish videos brings Shelley joy. And booktubers full of joy just make us all happy, don't they? The Dutch House follows Danny, son of Cyril, who after World War II invests in a very successful real estate venture, eventually buying a massive mansion, the Dutch House, which is complete with staff. Danny's mother leaves for hospital when he is very young and doesn't return. His older sister Maeve, almost a decade older than Danny, replaces her in his life. The events of the novels take place over half a century and look at things such as legacy, doing something you love, family, helping strangers versus helping your family, following in your father's footsteps. And I guess my big problem with this book was I found Danny to be an intensely dislikable character, which I don't think was the intention. He was selfish. He didn't deal with his shit. At some point he kept a massive secret from his sister because she had diabetes. I don't really understand that. And that is despite him being a trained doctor and Maeve having the condition for her entire life. I think this needs to be said. Being a landlord is not a job. It is the desire to be a social parasite. It is the commodification of something essential to our survival. It is simply the exploitation of those of us with lesser means. And the very ownership of real estate as an investment pushes the price of housing up, which in turn creates more people that can be exploited. And I just can't get behind a novel with a protagonist who is a self-centered member of the bourgeoisie and is presenting his lifestyle as hard and honest work. If you're viewing this and you own real estate where the renters can't afford to buy a house, then you really should sell it. It is the socially correct thing to do. You are essentially making money from rent through coercion. This is a mafia tactic, except you're doing it with nice real estate agents instead of people with guns, which just feels less honest, to be frank. I know it's a sensible investment, but you are a parasite. Sorry, I may have got slightly politically sidetracked there, and it's best we move on before I mention Robespierre and this video gets demonetized. I would have liked at least some of this book from the perspective of Maeve. She is very consistently overlooked by her family, particularly her father, who treats his two children very differently. And Maeve just accepts this of him, despite the clear unfairness of it all. Maeve seems to reject anything her father has to offer and wants to make it on her own. She seems quite pig-headed and unwaveringly loyal, and we see these traits in other areas of her life too, but her drive and personality just seems a little bit remote to me, a little bit kept from me. I don't understand her completely as a character. This is not due to her being ill-considered by Patchett. I just don't think that Patchett was able to communicate Maeve to the level that I wanted. She had her fully built in her mind when she was writing. It just didn't work on the page for me. Maeve, in my opinion, was a much more interesting character than Danny, not just more likable. And I think having her as the protagonist, even if it was just for a few chapters, would have made this book much better. As the novel goes on, Danny has marital difficulties, which are down to him not having an honest conversation with his wife. And I really struggle with a narrator, Danny in this case, that possesses the awareness to tell you why he has marital difficulties, but doesn't do anything about them. It doesn't seem very consistent, does it? I just wanted to scream, no, Danny, the marital difficulties you're having are down to you being selfish, not particularly in the marriage, but in life. As a human being, you're a twat, expecting the world to rotate around you. And I was reading this hoping that Danny would have a moment of realization, of clarity, and it never happened. It was like Patchett just wrote a douchebag and didn't realize it. The novel is really looking at letting go of your past to find happiness, something Danny is terrible at. If he was good at it, this novel might have been much shorter. It's kind of like every person in the past that he's lost contact with is their fault and he is angry about it. To be fair to Danny, he did lose contact with a lot of those people when he was 4 or 5, but he never gets over it. And I really struggle with the believability of a lot of this. I also didn't believe a lot of the side characters. Their actions just didn't make sense to me. It's not that they were out there, it's not that they were ridiculous, it's just not how I would have acted. And as such, I kind of need an explanation for why they were doing what they were doing. It kind of feels like these characters existed to push the plot forward. I mean, Fluffy just makes no sense as a character at all to me in this book. And characters seem to be able to remember obscure events in their life later on with great detail. At some point in this book, Danny remembers a grey-haired old woman in ER. And it's a classic example of this obscure event which later would have some meaning to Danny, but at the time shouldn't have meant anything. I did, however, enjoy the point in this book when Danny comments on the latest novel his wife and sister had both enjoyed, Housekeeping, which does bring me to the next book, Housekeeping by Marilyn Robinson, as recommended by Jess at Stalking Kafka. Jess has to be one of my favourite booktubers. She is very, very intelligent. She can be a little scattered and rambly, but that really works because she doesn't take herself too seriously. She often includes bloopers of herself filming, and it creates this very light-hearted and relaxed tone, which is cool because then she just says something, like she sees something in a book that I swear wasn't there until she mentioned it, and this rambly tone that she has makes her intelligent stuff feel extra mind-blowing. It's like, you know, I'm just being silly, but actually I'm quite intelligent under this. Jess is a booktuber for anybody who enjoys that sort of intelligent analysis. This is my very first Marilynne Robinson, and I was planning to start with Gilead, but I just really never got onto it, and sometimes the videos push you where you get a read, and that's not a bad thing for me anyway. Ruth and her sister Lucille grow up under the care of their grandmother, then an auntie, then another auntie, in a town called Fingerbone, which is a weird name. Never really figured out that metaphor. Maybe it's something to do with remoteness or extremities, but I'm not really sure it is. The girl's mother drove her car off a cliff and into a lake, hence the ever-changing guardianship they experience. The girl's grandfather died in the same lake the mother committed suicide in, but his death involved a train. Housekeeping is part coming of age, part sisterly bond, part exploration of suicide, abandonment, grief, and the concept of home. It is the impact of suicide that is explored more than the actual suicide, which is a nice little twisting of an old topic. Suicide, I think, is one of those topics that is very easy to judge your characters on, especially when you're focused on the themes of abandonment. And Robinson doesn't judge the mother at all, which creates this feeling of detachment in Ruth, our narrator. Intellectually, I understand that emotion, but as a reader, I just wanted a tiny bit more detail here. I don't like assumptions when I'm reading, and detachment really is one of the hardest emotions to write, especially in the first person. I don't want to call this a major flaw, but it is, for me, a bit of a load-bearing one. Emotions are an opportunity to build characters, and while I'm sure Robinson knows everything about these characters, even now over 40 years after this book was published, I don't. But I do suspect that Jess does when she read this novel. And this is one of the really interesting things about when we disagree on books. Not Jess and I mean anybody. Sometimes it's about our tastes, but in this case, I think it's down to our interpretations of the characters. When it comes to prose, Robinson places one word after another in an absolutely delightful way. She's pretty good at prose. She can be a bit too detailed and a bit too slow, but not enough for me to label it a flaw, just more a flavour. Plot-wise, this is pretty simple. It's not the selling point of this book, nor is it taking anything away from it. It's not so much plotless, more that the plot isn't what you're going to enjoy out of this book, and everybody knows that. Technically and thematically, Robinson is doing some really lovely things. The ending of this book, where the house and the entire town of Fingerbone takes on this role of Ruth and Lucille's past, both physically, as in where it happened, and metaphorically, that is really, really intelligent and just a lovely tool. And it forces the reader to ponder what is next for the girls. This book really has to go down as a bit of a mixed bag for me, because yes, the character construction doesn't work for me, and that would have made the entire book better. But Robinson clearly is a very intelligent writer who has written the type of book that you could reread multiple times and take extra things from it. Brat by Gabrielle Smith, as recommended by Kieran Reader. Kieran is the chilled out lit girl who reads all the books with big brain energy and effortlessly understands them and is consistently making me jealous. Not just with her excellent literary insight, but also she occasionally does these great travel and reading vlogs, which, quite frankly, young people who have their shit together enough to read good books and travel the world, they can just get fucked. She is a real underappreciated gem of a booktuber. Brat is about a young man who is grieving the death of his father, coming to terms with a recent breakup, trying to write his second novel. I'm not sure trying is the correct word here. I think self-sabotaging is more accurate. All this while he is living in his dad's house, trying to clean it up so it can be sold. Again, I'm not sure trying is the correct word here. Before I review any book, I do like to refresh my memory of it. And I was really surprised when I was looking at this book to see that it had been classified as a horror novel. While this novel does contain a few supernatural things such as ghosts and a tape that slightly changes every time you watch it, I thought that they were literary devices designed to represent memory, grief and moving on. I did not think that they were intended to build suspense, at least not in that everybody is going to die and it's going to be horrible kind of way. Although this book does have a bit of a gothic feel to it, and I guess technically it's a haunted house novel. Still, I would call it horror adjacent, diet horror, or horror for people who don't actually like horror. Instead, this book is really looking at alienation, grief, transience, insecurity, and a millennial detachment from a world that has been designed to exploit you rather than help you. Gabrielle, our protagonist, same name as the author, this is clearly autofiction, is really struggling to throw out his parents' belonging, finding marijuana plants and wondering what to do with them. They're a bit of a surprise to find, and his father's intentions are hard to interpret. Should he sell the pot? Or should he throw them out like they're junk? Should he continue growing them? Does it have value, both monetarily or emotional? And while this does have a very druggy angle to it, it is asking the question, what do you do with your dead dad's stuff? And it gets into Gabrielle's grief. The pot plants are a catalyst for a big fight between Gabrielle and his sister-in-law, who treats Gabrielle like he's trying to sabotage the sale of a house, something that is not unreasonable to think considering Gabrielle physically assaulted the real estate agent licensed to sell the property. Gabrielle's treatment of his sister-in-law is quite frankly horrible and unacceptable, and points to his desperate need of a hug. Gabrielle is constantly shedding skin due to a rare skin disorder that nobody seems to be willing to help him with. I found this an interesting allegory for him shedding layers of himself as he is processing not just the loss of his parents, but of his entire place in life, his identity, who he is, what direction will he move in next, who is he underneath the surface. Gabrielle is another unlikable character. You very much get the feeling of wasted privilege and frustration, the combination of a lack of care about who he hurts and an active will to hurt people, including himself. It does point to his pain and unhappiness, but also to his selfishness. Brat is indeed the correct word for him. I could have done without the relationship between Gabrielle and his brother. It is one of those relationships that is accurate to a certain type of male relationship, but I was expecting the constant unconscious homophobia, sexism, and the general toxic masculinity to have a point, and I don't really see one. This is not me commenting on it saying don't normalize homophobia and sexism, but I feel like it is symbolic of a bit of a flaw of this novel. There's a lot here, and it kind of feels like Smith has thrown everything at the wall to see what sticks. It's a little bit of a Jackson Pollock style novel. Pieces are done really well, while others are just sort of there, and you're left to ask, are they unintentional or just ill-explored? But if you are a reader who can focus on what is done well and ignore what is done poorly, then this is actually an excellent novel. Bad Habit by Alana S. Portero, translated from Spanish by Maria Fay Lethem, as recommended by Eric Carl Anderson. Eric is a bit of a joyful book nerd, one of the largest bookish channels on YouTube, well, certainly in the literary fiction genre. I really enjoy seeing Eric's reaction to book prizes, knowing that winning any prize will likely change an author's life, their financial situation, and so on. Eric is usually just so sincerely happy and joyful for them. The sheer number of authors he knows and has an emotional connection with is impressive. This novel is set during the heroin epidemic Madrid experienced during the 1990s. Bad Habits is a trans woman coming of age novel. Initially unnamed, our protagonist suppresses and denies her identity, avoiding things like makeup and other feminizing products, largely for reasons of fear and the threat of violence. The novel explores her feeling of isolation. I do love that she is suppressing her true identity and she is not telling us her name as well. But before I go on telling you about this trans woman, I do want to bring up a quote, Alana Potero. "I will not allow my novel to be labelled as LGBTQ+, to make it smaller, because it is not. Technically, this is a trans novel about identity, but I do love what Potero is saying with this quote. The themes that surround trans identity in this book, such as a feeling of isolation, of learning to accept yourself, of overcoming internalized learnt biases against yourself or your own identity, of peer pressures, of the contradictory desires of fitting in and being yourself. None of that is exclusively trans or LGBT. That is universal stuff that a lot of LGBT people happen to go through as well. These are themes and emotions that we all can relate to and learn from. And that, in turn, allows us to better empathize with our protagonist. This novel is also about so much more. It is about the Madrid suburb of San Blas during the 1990s, about a heroin epidemic, about being working class, poor, the struggle to survive. This is a novel with a real strong sense of place. Potero is able to blend this love she has for the city with an unflinching look at the grittiness and flaws of it. Her descriptions are far from complimentary, but it is also clear that she loves this part of Madrid. And the publishers here are marketing this book as similar to Shuggie Bain. I do think Shuggie Bain is a good measure of if you would like this book, but I think the city in Bad Habits is playing the same role as Agnes, Shuggie's mum, does in Shuggie Bain. It is the city that is flawed, the somewhat abusive family member who has been through a lot, that you still love, even if maybe it would be easier for you if you didn't. I read a number of Spanish reviews of this book praising its remarkable prose, and I'm sorry to say that it's not there in the translation. The prose isn't ugly or bad, but it's not beautiful or anything special, and I think that's one of the reasons why my ranking of this book isn't higher. There's a lot of potential here, and if we continue with the comparison to Shuggie Bain, I'm not getting the same level of punches that Shuggie delivers. It's hitting all the same spots, but then just not hitting as hard. And I do think some really elegant and evocative prose could have really rammed that home and made this a really good book. So I really recommend this book if you can read Spanish. I also think that this is a great book club novel because while I think the translation is not as good as the original, you can still see a lot of genius under this. And when you get half a dozen people in a room discussing a book, telling you what they saw, then you can probably unpack a lot more in this novel. Evenings and Weekends by Ossian McKenna, as recommended by Jack Edwards. If you watch any sort of book reviews on YouTube and you're watching some Aussie with a tick over 4,000 subs, I'm gonna guess you know who Jack Edwards is already, a booktuber with over 1 million subs. I'm pretty sure Jack is the biggest bookish creator on YouTube. Although, correct me if I'm wrong, there is quite a few big Spanish language booktubers who I'm unfamiliar with. Jack has a wonderfully intelligent and sophisticated way of reviewing books that he makes look effortless. And I think a lot of us creators are a bit in awe of how he does that. But I don't want to talk for other people. I'll just say that I am in awe of how he does that. Set in the London heatwave that was June 2019, this is a messy queer novel about sex, relationships, marriage, sexuality, friendship, the financial burden on younger adults, pregnancy, and secrets. As any self-respecting novel of similar themes does, it is comparing itself to Sally Rooney, a disappointing comparison from an otherwise very good book. Told with multiple perspectives, McKenna is able to build tension as the novel hurls towards a party where everybody meets. Maggie is pregnant and looking to move back to the suburbs to raise a child and away from London. She is grieving the life she imagined herself having. Ed is a courier and really doesn't earn enough to raise the child he will soon have with Maggie. As a bisexual, he kind of misses sex with men. Then he catches a look from a man on the train and follows him into the station toilets before questioning what he's doing there and seeing somebody he thinks he recognizes. Phil has just seen Ed enter a bathroom with a man, and he has to decide if he is going to tell his friend Maggie what Ed is up to and the past that Phil and Ed had. With the character Ed, McKenna has a very difficult task. He is not a likable character, but it's important that you empathize with him to get the most out of this book so that you can understand his actions and the pressures upon him. And I think McKenna finds that delicate balance in his character creation. A bisexual can just be in a heterosexual relationship and pass, and that kind of exerts a pressure on them, but surely they want to experiment with all their options to figure out if they have a preference or not. Ed's got a bit of all this going on. He has a complex sexual identity, one that confuses him and drags up a lot of emotions and conditioning that he needs to get past. And also, he doesn't want to stuff things up with Maggie, like he so nearly did with the stranger in the tube toilet station. Phil comes across as a very anxious and depressed young man. He might be able to enter his first relationship with his roommate, Keith, but the exact nature of that relationship is confusing. I think it's a very intelligent idea to contrast how Phil and Keith are looking at their relationship and what it might be and how things might work, how many people will be in it, and whether they'll have an open relationship. While Phil is considering if he should tell Maggie about Ed, maybe Maggie and Ed are poly. He's pretty sure they're not, but maybe they are. I do love how LGBT society has embraced different relationships. A poly, thruples, open relationship. It asks what even is a relationship and how do these different relationships work. And I can't help but to think maybe the way the economy is going at the moment, it could possibly be easier to buy a house if you were in a relationship with two people rather than one, or three, or four. Pregnant Maggie knows her life is about to change forever, but she doesn't know what shape she wants it to take. She still loves Ed, but can he be relied upon to help raise their child? This is a really finely balanced novel, and it requires really strong characters to pull off, because through them all, the themes of this novel are explored. Weak characters would equal weak themes. Fortunately for this novel, it doesn't have that problem. The writing has a lovely flow about it, which keeps the plot ticking over for me. And my only real criticism of this book is maybe saying more about me than it is the book. The setting is very well constructed. I'm just not sure why it's important to this novel at all. I feel like this book could be set in any major city and that wouldn't change it. But I'll tell you something about this book. One of the reasons why I like to review books online is it forces me to sit down and to think about a novel and ponder it. I don't really like commenting on a novel before I've reviewed it, because I don't feel like I've finished reading it until it is reviewed. And sometimes, such as with this book, when you sit down and consider it, it improves considerably. The Known World by Edward P. Jones, as recommended by Dee at Brown Girl Reading. Dee is one of the original booktubers with over a decade worth of book reviews and bookish content. She delivers that sort of quality old school booktube content, turns the camera on and just films, but she still says lots of very intelligent and well considered things, all that while giving you her gut reaction to a book. She reads a combination of new releases, classics and backlist novels. She hosts the Caribbean Readathon. She lives in France and is a Black American woman, giving her a perspective and an insight that I think few reviewers have. The Known World tackles something I have never considered in the history of slavery in the USA. That is free black people owning black slaves. In this case, particularly Henry Townsend, a slave until he was 10, who grew up to own slaves to support his business endeavours. Slavery and racism are so linked in our conscious today, and the issue of slavery particularly gets a little bit simplified. It is horrific and horrible and completely wrong, but today we live in a world where slavery is hidden from us in faraway countries as part of a complex supply chain manufactured by multinational companies, such as but not limited to the brands on the screen. We never got rid of slavery, but we were successful from moving it out of our backyard. And that means that most of us are distant enough from it to just call it evil and not to see the layers of details, not to see the muck and slime that makes that up. And there is a line in this book that I really do love. It's very simple. I'm just doing the same thing that any white man would do. But it really does point out who benefits from slavery. It's not just white men, but it's the business owners. And you can see that even when black people were freed, they would really struggle to get ahead in a world with slavery, in an economy where slavery is normal, because they have that ethical dilemma of, well, do I buy a slave or not? And then finally, it really gets to the heart of this very keeping up with the Joneses sort of attitude of slavery. Well, Frank has a slave, so now we're going to have to get one too. I'm certainly not arguing that slavery isn't horrible, but by exploring these unconsidered aspects of it, you really gain a deeper understanding of it, one that you can't get from a simpler, more polarized representation of it. It is one of the reasons why I think having Irish people in slave colonies makes for really interesting fiction. It forces you to consider what is actually happening and why and how. The strength of this novel is in its explanation of themes and ideas through the characters, which I think is quite honestly done superbly. I love a book that can both make me think and can make me empathize with all the characters, even the ones I strongly disagree with. The storytelling was episodically very, very good, but it would often jump forward or back in time, and I found this really disorientating. Maybe the structure could have been a little bit better. The setting came through very strongly. The fear and lack of security black people had, the lawlessness of the law, the general mood and emotions of the location were all so vivid. I didn't have anything positive or negative to say about the prose. It didn't get in the way of the other aspects of the novel, which I think is the correct choice for a novel like this. I don't need my breath taken away by purple prose in a book that is already hitting me hard in the emotions. This is not just a good book, but I also think that it's a safe book for all readers. A book that almost everybody is going to like. Unless you're grossed out by the early masturbation scene or some of the horrific violence in this novel. Actually, maybe it's not that safe a book after all, but it's probably safe if you're watching this video. Little Fish by Casey Platt, as recommended by Anna Marie of Actual Spinster. If you enjoy books, knitting, feminism, lesbians, or just really intelligent people, you need to subscribe to Anna Marie. I love a book that can teach me things. And the same thing is true about booktubers. She is a very smart cookie. Before I review Little Fish, I'm going to tell you something about it. Partway through this book, I was thinking, this tuk-tuk side plot is really familiar. Have I read this novel before? So I checked it out, and it turns out I DNF'd it a few years ago. And I think you can probably tell by the position in this video that I had a vastly different experience with it on the second try. And it really does show to me that sometimes you're just not in the right mood for the right book. This is the story of Wendy, a 30-ish trans woman who believes her grandfather, a now dead devout Mennonite, was also trans. While this is the underlying plot, a lot of this novel is focused on alcohol abuse, suicide, sex work, being trans, friendship, and found family. I really enjoyed Wendy's father, Ben, who was just loving of his daughter. So often in queer books, the family doesn't accept their queer child. But Ben even talks to Wendy about getting her tits done. He comes across more as a friend than a father, but in that dorky dad trying to be a cool dad but we like him anyway sort of friend. Wendy has quite a few trans friends who are also very important to the plot, and a boss who has been forced to make her redundant. Not his fault, he's just middle management and the store he runs is closing, but he may or may not be coming on to Wendy. Sex is so central to this novel, as too is sex work. LGBT people are overrepresented in sex work, and trans people are overrepresented amongst queer people. This provides a complex look into how men see trans women. It's complex and it can be quite horrible. It's hard to separate misogyny, homophobia, self-hate, a lack of self-acceptance, and trans misogyny in some of these men's actions. But we also learn about the trans woman within the sex work scene. Is it really about the money? Well, yes, of course it's about the money. Trans people are economically disadvantaged and exploited and often have difficulty finding work due to their identity, not to mention the prohibitive prices of surgery. But Wendy is employed, albeit tenuously. Another trans woman is well off and still does this. So it's definitely not just about the money. It's much more complex than that. Is it that gender care is expensive and surgery costs big money? Not all trans women are alike in their motivations either, and we're not presented with a silver bullet answer in this novel. Sex work also places these women in contact with drugs and can lead to substance abuse. In Wendy's case, it is alcohol. There is also the threat of violence these women face and the annoyance of dealing with time wasters, the long distance travelled, the cost of seedy motel rooms. The reasons these women do sex work definitely varies, but all those reasons are good enough to overcome the drawbacks. One of the most comical scenes in this book really points to the stresses that go along with it. And it's when Wendy is booked by a client who still thinks she has a penis and asks for certain services that are quite difficult for Wendy to perform without one. Certainly those actions wouldn't be gender affirming, but Wendy's actions here raise all sorts of questions. Why is she doing what she's doing? What does all this mean to her? Platt is able to find a lot of ambiguity in the scenes she writes, allowing them to make comments on multiple things at once, or rather, creating sentences that prompt our brains to consider multiple different situations and issues concurrently. And all of those things we consider just happen to be the themes of the novel. It's kind of like she picked these themes and then asked herself, how can they all have an orgy? There are a few little tidbits in this novel that I really enjoyed learning about. The concept of trans time and trans age being so different to what we're used to. If you want to look younger, folks. On the negative side of things, Platt's characters are either amazing or terrible. Her tone is very casual and matter-of-fact, and that works most of the time, but every now and then there is a character who I just didn't believe would talk in that tone. And I'm particularly thinking about one scene with a police officer. However, we're only talking about minor characters here, and as Wendy is our narrator as well as protagonist, we have to ask ourselves, is it just her retelling of the events? Is it just her tone that is coming across over the minor characters? And as such, it doesn't have a large impact upon whether this book is good or not. Before I tell you the best book in this experiment, although you may have already figured it out, I would like to thank my wonderful Patreons for their support. Without them, this video literally wouldn't have happened. I know I say that a lot, but in this case it's true. I have had terrible computer issues for the last couple of months, which has caused chaos with my video creation. I would normally have posted this video in August, and now it's December. The support of my patrons has allowed me to buy a new laptop to create this video and a new camera to film upon, which is of superior quality, and I'm not sure that's a good thing with this mug. Without my Patreons, I literally don't know how I would have filmed this video. The support of my Patreons is the only reason this video exists. So I'd really like to say a massive thank you to them for their support. And while I'm here, I'd like to have a cheeky call to action to anybody who is watching this video and enjoys my content. Maybe you could consider financially supporting this channel by signing up to my Patreon and safeguarding me from the next time a laptop decides to have a tantrum. Or you could just share this video, like, subscribe, those sort of things really do help too. Back to the books. Things I Have Withheld by Kai Miller, as recommended by Gemma from Gem of Books. Gemma is one of my favourite people on booktube. She makes me laugh, and she's not afraid to call a shit a turd. Also, she has wonderful tastes in books, as demonstrated by this one. This is also the only non-fiction book on the list. Normally I just stick to reading fiction, which is, my love. But Gemma has sold me on this one, and clearly she wasn't wrong. This is by some margin the best book in this video. An essay collection about racism and prejudice. Miller explores the grey and uncomfortable parts of these two things. Parts that we're maybe not used to, things that we maybe don't always see. Kai Miller is Jamaican, and Jamaica is an interesting place when it comes to racism. It is not racist in the same way Australia, the USA or the UK is, which really shouldn't be that big a surprise. After all, it's its own culture. Miller changes the way we think on racism with one very simple move. He does not talk about his skin, his culture, his DNA, heritage, or anything else like that. He simply talks about his body, the way he is treated differently because of his body. And I love this because he is instantly including gender discrimination, trans discrimination, fat discrimination, discrimination against people with visible disabilities, and anybody who expresses themselves in any sort of non-conforming way. He has taken a lot of the reader's prejudices out of the equation too. We live in a racist world. We have all been conditioned to be racist by the society around us. And when somebody says they're not racist, what they're often saying is, I don't understand how I could be racist. We are all learning after all. So to think about a body being the subject of discrimination, it takes out the specific black, Asian, mixed, indigenous, whatever it is, and just makes it human. And it makes it easier to empathize with Miller and to understand him, because almost all of us have been on the end of some form of discrimination because of our body, however small that discrimination is. Miller is not ignorant of his privilege either. Being educated and a professor as well as a writer, he discusses a time while travelling in Africa he was pulled over by a police officer and decides to present himself as a professor instead of a writer. So he could imply that he knows people that he could call after seeing the police officer and get him into trouble, and not that he would be writing about it. He is not ignorant of the advantages he has of living in the global north, or of being well off financially, being male, or of being able to pass as straight when required. Miller's various essays go to different places. He has travelled through Africa, and he talks about how he was treated there versus how he was treated in the Caribbean, the US and the UK. His ability to capture his privileges and the prejudice he faces in different locations feels very biased, very complete, and contains so much nuance of detail. He has so much empathy for some of the people who have tried to make his life miserable, allowing us, the readers, to really understand them, where their biases come from, their motivations, their influences, the work that they need to do. And he asks, what will honesty cost him? Jamaica is a racist country that doesn't think it's a racist country. There is simply so much in this book. Without mentioning economics or politics, he is showing us how poverty plays a role in crime and prejudice. Crime and prejudice. It's like our classic novels got mixed up and confused. He discusses being gay, James Baldwin, Liam Neeson's toxic masculinity, the symbolic power of a white woman, the power of words, of being an author. There is so much packed into these essays. It makes me dizzy trying to review it. This book is a bombardment of wisdom through short, empathetic stories from Miller's own life. And kind of bizarrely for non-fiction, this has all of the elements that I look for in good fiction. Miller's protagonist from these essays is basically himself. So it does feel a little cheeky to give him credit for creating a believable and good central character, but it is true. Also, his side characters are very alive and vivid as well. He's both thought-provoking and emotional. He can tell a story. The settings he creates, while real places he has visited, come through vividly. The emotional charge and the feel of a taxi ride, it all comes through. And it's not too often I read a non-fiction book and get excited about reading that author's fiction. But in this case I am. This is for fans of Emma Donoghue or James Baldwin. I really cannot recommend this book enough. If you enjoyed this video, I will be creating another one in late January or early February based on bookish content creators' best books of 2024, but it will likely be massive. The last 2 years I've done it with approximately 30 books. So make sure you're subscribed and ring that bell so you don't miss that one. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.